I'm Teresa.
And I'm Callista, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime. Today, we're finishing up the first part of our theme on killer nurses with the recent case of Heather Pressdee. A little after 9 a.m. on Wednesday, May 24th, 2023, officers arrived at 608 South Meadow Street to an unassuming townhouse in Natrona Heights, a small community in Harrison Township in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, to execute search warrants of the home, vehicles, and cellular devices, and to interview the occupant, Heather Pressdee. Heather knew exactly why the officers were at her door. She just wondered which murders they knew about. Officers were allowed to search Heather's various social media accounts and even her Netflix. After technicians reviewed these accounts, they would find a September 26, 2018 Facebook post where Heather ineloquently says, "I may kill a doctor today." She was angry that the doctor had criticized her for checking a patient's blood sugar. She ended the post with, "I know what hypoglycemia looks like." And it was true that Heather had received training in both hypoglycemia and diabetic training. She had also managed her mother's diabetic care, so she was very familiar with treating this all too common disease. Heather's Pinterest page even had several pins about various types of insulin and how blood sugar is regulated. She'd also pinned an image of two spoons with one spoon containing 2 units of insulin and the other spoon containing 10 units with the following message: "If you needed to take 2 units of insulin and accidentally took 10 units instead, it could be deadly in a matter of hours." A forensics team would also analyze her cell phone and note some chilling texts between her and her mother, but we'll talk more about those a little later. Considering her diabetic training and Pinterest activity, it was hardly surprising that during her police interview, Heather admitted to injecting 3 patients with insulin, killing 2. She said that she felt bad for their quality of life and had hoped that they would simply slip into a coma and pass away. As for the patients she decided it didn't have lives worth living, they were 55-year-old James Bartow and 83-year-old Joseph Campbell, who were receiving care at Quality Life Services in Chickara, or QLSC. Both victims were under Heather's care when they were transported to the hospital for hypoglycemia and arrived within 30 minutes of each other. James died at the hospital on December 4th, 2022, after suffering respiratory failure and a continuous fever, and Joseph died on December 24th. A nurse practitioner who worked with Heather recalled that Heather had explicitly told her that Joseph would be better off dead. The third victim, only identified by his initials EA, was sharing a room with James when he suffered a near fatal incident on August 31st. He was found seizing in his bed, even though he didn't have a history of seizures. His blood sugar was checked, and although it was low, a hospital stint isn't indicated for EA. Thankfully, he survived Heather's attempted murder. Of the 3 men, only Joseph was diabetic, though it is indicated that he was non insulin dependent.
Heather was arrested on May 25th, 2023, and held without bail at the Butler County Prison. She was charged with 2 counts of homicide, 1 count of attempted murder, a count of aggravated assault, 3 counts of neglect of a care dependent person, and 3 counts of reckless endangerment. Before we dive into the destructive path Heather left at numerous medical facilities she worked at, let's learn a little bit more about her. Unfortunately, details regarding her personal life are rather scant. Heather was born in Western Pennsylvania on August 28, 1982, to Michael and Bonita Presti. She is the oldest of 2 children. In 2003, Heather began attending the Community College of Allegheny County for nursing, but she didn't graduate. Instead, in 2004, she began working at Pittsburg Veterinary Specialty and Emergency Center. She worked there for 14 years. At some point during her employment, she became a licensed veterinary technician. where she provided critical care to ill animals, giving them anesthesia and sometimes euthanizing them. We don't know if this is where Heather's attitude about putting people out of their misery originated. I'm sure if you have listened to true crime for a while, you have heard of the McDonald triad, and that cruelty to animals is a common trait of future serial killers. Cruelty to animals and people make my blood boil, as I'm sure it does most everyone. So I'm going to assume any animals euthanized by Heather were due to necessity.
But that doesn't mean she didn't twistedly enjoy it.
Too true. Heather returned to school and graduated in May 2018 with an associate's degree in nursing. Heather's first job as a registered nurse was with Encompass Health Rehabilitation Hospital of Harmarville. Her first day on the job was October 1st, 2018, and her last day was April 21st, 2019. Heather's employment file indicates that she was counseled less than 2 months from her hire date on December 7th due to an error with the administration of insulin and not following a doctor's orders. The file further notes that Heather took it upon herself to decide the amount of insulin patients needed and ignored the doctor's dosing instructions. She was supposed to meet with a nurse educator and diabetic coordinator to review correct insulin administration. It's not clear if this actually happened. Additionally, a nurse supervisor was concerned that she was harming patients by making up her own insulin doses, as you would be. It seems from her short stint at Encompass that she was fired for not following dosing orders and potentially harming patients.
As she should have been. Heather took a little break, maybe to make sure nothing was going to stop her from harming more patients, like the police becoming involved. When it didn't, she started her next job at Platinum Ridge Center for Rehabilitation and Healing in Brackenridge. Her employment started in September 2019 and ended 4 months later in January 2020. Heather's treatment of patients was not indicated for this employer. However, it was noted that she used a fake name but a family member's phone number as an employment reference. I mean, it's not like she could have listed Encompass.
I mean, obviously not, though if she had, they wouldn't have mentioned their very real concerns.
Good point. After a 9 month hiatus, she started her third healthcare job on October 30th, 2020, at Concordia at Rebecca Residence, a nursing home in Allison Park. Heather, because the first time worked like a charm, again used the name of a fictitious colleague as a reference with one of her family members' phone numbers. It seems like no one checked this fake reference out, leaving Heather to get away with murder when on December 17th, Ruth Erickson, an 89-year-old resident, died. Heather provided direct care for her during the night shift on December 16th and through the morning of December 17th, which included giving her medication because Ruth was crying, saying she was in pain. Heather also claimed to have provided comfort measures, which generally refers to end of life care and includes giving the patient support and comfort, such as holding the patient's hand, speaking in a calm and soothing voice, and even reading to the patient.
I'm not sure how much comfort she would have actually provided since it seems death is her goal.
I feel like none, or only when someone else was around. Heather's story was that she found Ruth with no heartbeat and recorded the time of death. However, in a later interview, Heather admitted that she had administered 120 units of insulin to the non diabetic patient. Because Ruth was in hospice and wasn't doing well, Heather first gave her a dose of 60 units. When that didn't have the desired deadly effect, she gave her another 60 units, killing her. Yet, her last day of employment came months after the murder on April 11th, 2021.
No long employment break this time, which could be due to COVID times and a serious lack of healthcare workers. Heather was hired as Assistant Director of Nursing, or ADON, and began working at Bel Air Healthcare and Rehabilitation in Lower Burrell on April 19th, 2021. She seemed woefully underqualified for this position with less than a year and a half of nursing experience. But what do we know?
I get it was an all hands on deck kind of situation, but that's quite the promotion.
certainly is. The ADON, as the name suggests, assists the director of nursing, our Don. The ADON and Don, I guess I could say ADON, but anyway, are in charge of all nursing staff and all administrative tasks that have to be completed to meet all state and federal guidelines. They also address any resident care concerns, conduct internal investigations, investigate allegations of abuse, and handle the scheduling of nursing staff. They also provide direct resident care in the event of nursing shortages. Heather's coworkers became concerned that Heather was killing residents and that there was a pattern of patients dying under her care. These accusations resulted in Heather being suspended pending an internal investigation. Unsurprisingly, the investigation determined there was no identifiable evidence uncovered to support the concerns of Heather's coworkers, which seems like a big fuck you for speaking up and putting patient care first.
Yeah, keep your mouth shut and don't stir up any scandals.
Apparently so. On August 9th, 58-year-old Sherry Stilatino died. She was a non insulin dependent diabetic. Heather was, of course, on duty and provided care to her on July 23rd. She noted in her chart that she was doing well. However, on July 24th, she was found to have a low blood sugar reading. Paramedics were called and she was transported to the hospital and admitted for hypoglycemia. She returned to Bel Air on July 30th. On August 2nd, Heather noted in the patient's chart that her blood sugar dropped suddenly and she was again sent to Allegheny Valley Hospital. Heather provided care to the patient until her admittance to the hospital. Sherry was stabilized at the hospital and returned to Bel Air on August 6th. Another nurse noted on August 8th that there were no signs of hypoglycemia. On August 9th, Heather said that she found the patient without a pulse and she was declared deceased shortly thereafter. Following Heather's arrest, almost 3 years later, Allegheny Valley Hospital's chief medical officer contacted investigators and reported that Sherry was seen in the ER on August 2nd due to hypoglycemia. In a later interview, Heather admitted that she administered 60 units of insulin and that the patient died within 2 hours of the insulin injection. When questioned as to why she administered the insulin, she said that the patient looked at her like a wounded animal would, helpless and like she needed something. She further said she had no quality of life. Freaking monster that is not up to you to decide.
Too right. On September 28th, Marianne Bauer, who was 68 at the time, died. Heather was providing direct care to Marianne on the day of her death. Before noting the time of death at 4:10 p.m., with the patient's family at her bedside, Heather said that Marianne wasn't swallowing and that she was offering her comfort measures. But in a later interview, Heather admitted to administering 100 units of insulin and said that Marianne was actively passing due to her inability to breathe. She further stated that the pain medication that had been prescribed by a doctor wasn't relieving her pain, so Heather took it upon herself to inject her with insulin. Marianne was, once again, not a diabetic. Heather stated that because of the patient's weight, she gave her a larger dose, to make sure she died. Attorney Rob Pierce filed a lawsuit against Bel Air on behalf of Marianne's family. Bel Air hired Heather even though she had a troubling history, having been terminated or forced to resign from several healthcare facilities due to allegations of abuse towards both patients and staff. The lawsuit also referenced the Pennsylvania Department of Health, which cited Bel Air for a series of deficiencies. These included failing to assess and document changes in residents' blood sugar levels, failing to notify physicians of residents' condition changes, and failing to follow physicians' orders. The DOH issued citations as an alert, indicating that residents were in immediate jeopardy due to the nursing home's noncompliance with regulations.
Imagine being able to keep the doors of a medical clinic open when the DOH says patients are in immediate jeopardy.
Because those aren't exactly small issues. Attorney Pierce also said that the staff were aware of Heather's troubling behavior referring to her as the killer nurse. Continuing with Heather's troubling behavior, Jack Rogers, 79, died at Bel Air on November 16th. Heather admitted to investigators that she had injected Jack, who was not diabetic, with 100 units of insulin.
92-year-old Mary Caldwell died at Bel Air on December 28. 2 days earlier, an LPN working with Mary noted that her mood appears pleasant. She was oriented to person, meaning she could identify herself and those around her, and that the medications were effective. The next day, Heather took over Mary's care and noted that there was a change in her condition and that she had called the MD about the change. Heather took Mary's vital signs, but notably did not take her blood sugar. She noted that Mary was unresponsive, and Heather spoke to her family members. The family elected to have comfort measures only. At 11 a.m., an occupational nurse attempted to enter Mary's room. Heather asked her to leave. The nurse waited a short time and then tried again to enter the room. Heather vehemently insisted that Mary not be touched.
Because that's not at all sus.
Alarm bells should have been blaring. Mary died at 1:19 p.m. Heather pronounced her time of death. Heather later admitted that she had administered 60 units of insulin to Mary. February 24th, 2022, an 88-year-old male resident suffered a hypoglycemic incident, but thankfully did not die as a result of this incident. The patient was not diabetic. He was found unresponsive with a blood sugar reading of 38. He was given glucagon in an attempt to raise his blood sugar. He was sent to the hospital, and upon arrival, his blood sugar was tested and was 83. His blood sugar continued to rise. Because of his blood sugar readings, he was given a C-peptide test, and the readings were found to be low and outside the normal range. His doctor concluded that insulin had been administered to a non-diabetic patient. He remained in the hospital until March 11, when he was released. Heather would later admit to administering 100 units of insulin to the victim. Another doctor at Allegheny Valley Hospital was concerned that this patient, along with Sherry Stilatino, had both come from Bel Air and were both treated by Heather. He made a referral to the Pennsylvania Department of Health, concerned that Heather was harming patients.
About time. Administrators at Bel Air eventually, and we assume begrudgingly, investigated Heather's conduct and temporarily suspended her. However, they said they were not able to find evidence to support staff's concerns that she was killing patients. In the midst of these concerns, and as we mentioned in Attorney Pierce's lawsuit, the state health department investigated the center, stating its residents were in immediate jeopardy. The Pennsylvania Department of Health said it could not confirm when the complaint was received. However, they did confirm that they made a criminal referral to the AG's office in December of 2022. They further stated, the Department of Health takes all complaints seriously and follows up on all complaints. The department is also subject to statutory confidentiality requirements that restrict what the department can share publicly about its regulatory enforcement actions. Complaints submitted to the department are not publicly available.
This is such a load of crap. You can't say that you follow up on all complaints after submitting a complaint to the AG, that residents are in danger, and then do nothing.
Just make it sound like you care, but don't actually follow through. That seems like the name of the game.
It sure does.
For its part, Bel Air said in a statement that it could not comment on the case regarding Heather due to privacy laws and pending litigation, but added that it has policies and procedures in place designed to vet the qualifications and background of potential employees, and we take seriously our responsibility to keep our residents safe.
So say that you have a vetting process for potential employees, but you really don't.
I mean, evidently, since she was hired for a position for which she was woefully underqualified, Heather left Bel Air less than a year after she started on February 28th, 2022. All right, we're back to the medical clinic that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, QLSC. Heather began working at QLSC again as the ADON on May 23rd, 2022. She would admit in subsequent interviews that she had unsuccessfully attempted to kill an 83-year-old patient, only referenced by her initials BS, on June 21st. She had given BS several units of insulin, but she was able to sleep it off, which makes it sound like it was just a bad hangover.
It totally does.
Nonetheless, BS survived Heather's intentions, and again, BS was not diabetic.
Less than 2 months later, 90-year-old patient James Fair would not be so lucky. He died on August 6th. James was found seizing in his bed. He was given morphine and Ativan, but did not survive. 2 days later, Heather received an email from the Butler County Area Agency on Aging asking for clarification on James' death. She indicated that he suffered a massive seizure. Heather would later admit to administering 60 units of insulin to, again, non diabetic James. Another patient who survived Heather's attempted murder was 51-year-old CK, who was diabetic and suffered two separate hypoglycemic incidents on October 8th and 9th. He was given glucose gel and stabilized. In a later interview, Heather admits to giving CK 60 units of insulin.
And you have to wonder what complications the patients who survived were left with, because it's not as if she gave them an extra Tylenol.
Exactly. Less than a month later, on November 6th, 99-year-old Betty McQueenie, a non diabetic patient, died. Heather noted in her chart that she was found with no heartbeat and that CPR was unsuccessful. Again, Heather would later admit to administering 60 units of insulin. She also chillingly admitted that she knew she had killed Betty, but she left the room and left a nursing aide to find her about 30 minutes later. Heather then pretended to administer CPR on the already deceased patient.
I mean, it is true that if she had been the one to find all of them, even those who were the most willing to bury their heads in the sand would be forced to give her a second glance.
Another lucky patient, BH, a 93-year-old non diabetic female who was confined to a wheelchair and unable to move on her own and had been on hospice care since October 19th, 2021, was under Heather's care for numerous days in November 2022. Notations in her chart show widely varying blood sugar readings. Heather would later admit that she gave BH 60 units of insulin, but it had been unsuccessful and that the patient had vomited several times but survived.
It's like she sees it all as an experiment. Oh, too low of a dose. Murder attempt unsuccessful. Try harder next time.
Yeah, I mean, did she write what did and didn't work in her notes app?
Yeah, super nice.
Thankfully, at least for the patients there, Heather's employment with QLSC ended on November 28th.
Allowing no reprieve for prospective victims, Heather started her next job at Premier Armstrong Rehabilitation and Nursing Center in Kittanning on November 30th, where she would last only 1 month. Well before 99-year-old Louise Skinner died on December 18th, Heather began noting in Louise's chart on December 11th that her daughter should consider hospice care because of her mother's sodium and chloride levels. She commented numerous times in the next 6 days that Louise remained lethargic. She also prepared a change in condition report alleging an altered mental status and unresponsiveness. On December 17th, she recorded that she checked Louise's blood sugar, which wasn't warranted for someone without diabetes, and that the reading was high. Even though Louise had experienced several episodes of apnea where she stopped breathing for up to 30 seconds, Heather did not provide any medical intervention or alert any doctors. And a little after 1 a.m. on December 18th, Louise was dead. Heather would later admit to injecting Louise with 60 units of insulin. 85-year-old Alice Stewart died on December 27th. Alice was a non insulin dependent diabetic. She was hard to wake and had a temperature of 102, which can be a symptom of hypoglycemia. She was transported to the hospital but returned to Premier after her condition stabilized. Upon her return, her condition worsened and she died, all because Heather had given Alice her usual murderous dose of 60 units of insulin. Not wasting any time, on January 2nd, 2023, Heather was able to secure another nursing job at Sunnyview Rehabilitation and Nursing in Butler. This time, she was hired as the unit manager. This high ranking position left the most deaths in her wake. Her duties included overseeing the LPNs and CNAs, providing direct patient care when there were staffing shortages, and, most importantly, she had keys to the medication room. In her text messages to the ADON, Heather volunteered to be responsible for the medicine cart. A CNA that worked closely with Heather said she often said that residents just needed to die. An LPN that often worked with Heather said that unit managers sometimes worked the med cart, but that Heather always seemed excited when she was tasked with this. It's not like in elementary school when the teacher picks you to do a task. There should be no excitement in this situation.
That was good. It's not at all like helping pass out worksheets. She's excited because eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which victim do I choose tonight?
Super twisted.
Yeah. Marguerite Laskovich, 80, passed away on January 21st. She was diabetic and on hospice care. Heather provided direct care and would later indicate that due to Marguerite's low oxygen, she injected her with 60 units of insulin. Low oxygen, even in a diabetic patient, doesn't mean they need an injection of insulin, but that is just an excuse. Heather decided Marguerite should die. Anne Victane, 104, passed away on March 21st. Staff who were interviewed said that they were surprised by Anne's passing. They stated she was doing well and was able to walk around unassisted. She was eating and responsive.
And good going at 104.
Yeah, there are people decades younger that require some help with walking.
Sadly.
An LPN caring for Anne on March 20th provided her with a food tray and her dentures. Heather asked her, "How could you touch her teeth?" and that Anne was disgusting.
Because I'm sure the most disgusting thing a nurse has ever been asked to do is touch a patient's teeth.
I thought the exact same thing. When an LPN went to check on her a little after 9 a.m. on the 21st, she was foaming at the mouth. Heather commented to a CNA, "When is she going to die already?" No surprises here. When later interviewed, Heather admitted to administering 60 units of insulin. Irene Simons, 78, passed away 3 days after Anne. She was suffering with COPD and had respiratory issues. She was receiving hospice care, but her death was unexpected. Irene's daughter, Elizabeth Ozella, had been visiting her and noticed that her skin felt warm and oily. She left the facility for about 30 minutes, and when she returned, her breathing was irregular. She said that Heather entered the room with the med cart. She excused herself and went to the restroom. When she returned, a few minutes later, her mother was dead. Heather would admit to injecting Irene not with 60, but a total of 120 units of insulin. She doubled the dose because the first 60 didn't immediately kill her.
And God forbid she has to wait around for her victims to die.
So evil. Hurry up and die already. I have things to do.
Yeah. Two families of Heather's alleged victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against Sunnyview, claiming liability and negligence regarding Heather and her patients' unusual deaths, as they fucking should have. And one of the lawsuits was filed by Irene's daughter. Elizabeth alleges that when she left the room for a short period of time, Heather gave her mother 60 units of insulin, which led to Irene having irregular and labored breathing. When Elizabeth returned, Heather informed her that her mother had died while she was out of the room, causing Elizabeth to cry and crawl into bed with her recently deceased mother. As stated in the lawsuit, Heather remained in the doorway and watched Elizabeth grieve beside her. Later, Heather sent flowers and a card to the funeral home where Irene was being memorialized. The handwritten note said, and loving memory of Irene Elizabeth Simons. She will be missed. Sorry for your loss. Love, Heather. Sunnyview. Not that murder is any better, but getting off on the family's grief is just gross.
It really is. And Jesus, get out of her freaking room. You killed her. I mean, let her daughter have some privacy.
Mm-hmm. The very next day, on March 25th, Gerald Shrum, age 90, died. A review of his records showed that he was receiving direct care from Heather, and it is noted that his blood sugar dropped significantly before his death. He was a non insulin dependent diabetic. An interview with an LPN working the shift when Gerald died said she found him foaming at the mouth. Even though we have already mentioned that with patient and Victane, this thankfully is not a normal occurrence. The nurse went on to say that she had only seen this reaction when a patient is given medicine to lower their blood sugar. Another LPN working with Heather on that same shift said his blood sugar readings had been low, but that they had been stabilized. They had even inserted a port for an IV line in case they needed to quickly attach a dextrose strip. But at the time, Heather was working the med cart, and when the nurse returned from her break, Gerald was dead. Despite his symptoms pointing to a blood sugar problem, a doctor treating Gerald said that his blood sugar hadn't been an issue. One of the LPNs working with Gerald confirmed this by adding that in the past 7 months working with him, his blood sugar never went low. The nurses, along with Adon, were all shocked by his unexpected death. On top of their disbelief, Gerald's family, who had served as his carers for many years, noted that his blood sugar sometimes ran high, but never low. In what will come as a shock to no one, Heather would later admit that she administered insulin to Gerald, but when he didn't die quickly enough, she administered 2 10-milliliter flushes to his IV port, which she hoped would cause an air embolism and finally kill him. An air embolism, by the way, is a blockage in a blood vessel caused by air bubbles and can cause permanent damage to the central nervous system. While investigators were reviewing Heather's cell phone records, they found a text that she had sent to the Adon on the day of Gerald's death. I just wanted to let you know, I forgot how long you have to report a death. I know the death wasn't related to the fall. Apparently, Gerald had fallen earlier in the day, but in her text, Heather really wasn't doing herself any favors in eliminating that as a possible cause she could have used for cover.
It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Not really.
Sandra Lincoln, 82, passed away on April 17th. She was also a non-insulin dependent diabetic. Sandra had terminal cancer and had planned to return home to pass in more comfortable surroundings. A CNA working that day said that Heather told her Sandra needed to die. She saw Heather exit her room and said she was in the dying process.
Aren't we all, Heather?
Every day we get a little closer.
That's right.
Heather later admitted to administering insulin to the victim. When that didn't kill her in a timely fashion, Heather administered a syringe of air into her PICC line to create an air embolism. Sandra stopped breathing once the air was administered. The last patient Heather is charged with murdering was 43-year-old Nicholas Simple, who died on April 30th, 2023. Nicholas had been diagnosed with diabetes at 10 and suffered a brain injury about 7 years before his death. Nicholas was labeled a brittle diabetic, which references the difficulty he had in regulating his blood sugar. He was often given insulin to treat his blood sugar. Nicholas also wore a Dexcom device, which measures and records blood sugar. A Dexcom device has an implanted sensor for continuous blood sugar monitoring. The readings are then sent to the patient's phone through an app, which sounds an alarm when the blood sugar reading is either too low or too high. The alarm is loud enough that people near the patient can also hear it. An endocrinologist who often treated Nicholas reviewed these records and said that it was clear that he had been injected with either a large dose of short-acting insulin or a combination of short-acting and long-acting insulin. The records also indicated that the only nurse that had been in direct contact with Nicholas on the overnight shift was Heather. An LPN said that Heather had made the comment that Nicholas was going to be the next one to die anyway. Another LPN had been talking with Nicholas the Friday before his death and told him how important it was that he take his medication and that she loved him and wanted to see him on Monday. And my black little heart, I'm trying not to read too much into that. I'm sure it was just a nice gesture and nothing inappropriate.
We're sure going to hope. One bad nurse is enough.
Yeah. Heather told the LPN that she heard her conversation and that it was gross. When the LPN returned on Monday, she learned that Nicholas had died. Heather, not too gently, hit her on the back and said, "Sorry to hear about Nicholas, but at least you got to say your final goodbye." Another CNA said that Heather really disliked Nicholas and that she called him retarded and that people with his quality of life did not deserve to live.
Does she realize these comments are offensive and suspicious, or is she just that cocky?
I mean, I think she is cocky, but also lacking any kind of, obviously, empathy or tact.
I mean, it can be both.
True. Another LPN noted that the morning of Nicholas's death, she went into his room to get him ready for dialysis and that he was fine. She left the room to retrieve something, and when she returned to the room, he was gone.
Heather mentioned to several nurses that they think I killed Nicholas. It was, after all, the unit manager's responsibility to ensure that the Dexcom device and the sensor were working properly. Heather was interviewed several times regarding Nicholas's death, and in the very first, she admitted to administering more insulin than she should have and realizing immediately that she had killed him. In a later interview, she said that she should have given him 7 units and she instead gave him 60. Nicholas Symble's family also, rightly, filed a lawsuit against Sunnyview. The lawsuit said that the nursing facility hired Heather in January 2023, despite her disturbing and alarming history of resident abuse at prior facilities. And too fucking true. The lawsuit states Heather caused injury or death to at least 16 patients at other facilities she worked at, and she was forced to resign or was terminated from each prior facility. But the lawsuit didn't even cover the extent of her crimes, because Heather herself confessed to harming 22 patients with the intent to kill. Her reign of terror spanned approximately 4.5 years at facilities in Armstrong, Allegheny, Westmoreland, and Butler counties. Heather would often work the med cart and would administer insulin during the night shift when staffing was lowest and the facilities were quiet.
I mean, how many other nurses have we covered that also prefer the night shift to make murdering their patients less prone to prying eyes?
It's almost like they want to get away with their crime so they can keep killing. Heather even tried to time her injections so that her victims would die before a shift change and hopefully avoid being sent to the hospital, where a C peptide test could be administered. Additionally, if a victim didn't die with the first dose of insulin, she would either give them a second dose or attempt an air embolism. The Attorney General's office began investigating the case after receiving tips about Heather from the Pennsylvania Department of State and from a family member of one of the patients who died at QLSC. QLSC, either trying to minimize the damage or showing actual concern for the patients entrusted to their facility, said they would fully cooperate with the Attorney General's office as needed in the investigation and prosecution of this matter, and assured its patients and their families that all residents of Quality Life Services Chickara are safe and are receiving appropriate care and service.
First, they are required to fully cooperate with an investigation unless they want their license pulled. Second, how can they say all patients are safe? I know they are just words, but when one of your prior nurses stands accused of killing patients at your and other facilities, maybe just say you're cooperating. I am sure one of the facilities simply categorized Heather as a bad apple. Though I think we have seen with Heather and the other nurses we have covered that vetting future employees doesn't seem to be high on anyone's list. Heather worked at 11 nursing facilities from 2018 to 2022. She was fired from several, or forced to resign for patient and staff mistreatment.
Yeah, let's be real. QLSC was looking out for themselves. Maybe they do care about patients, but they should have shown it by doing their due diligence when lives were at stake.
Yeah. Heather was repeatedly hired by facility after facility despite leaving previous employers after being fired or resigning, often under investigation or amid concern she was harming patients. There are clearly loopholes in which Heather was able to jump from facility to facility to continue to commit these murderous acts. As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Heather wasn't arrested until May 25th, 2023, 3 years after she began killing patients. 6 patients died that we're aware of after a doctor filed a complaint with the state. Investigative reporters from local Pittsburg News 11 Investigates asked the Department of State why the Nursing License Board did not pull Heather's nursing license sooner. Color me shocked, but the spokeswoman declined to answer and cited state confidentiality statutes for their reasoning in not providing the greater Pittsburgh community with answers.
It's interesting how confidentiality policies and agreements often align with ass covering.
It sure does. Just like in our episode regarding Texas nurses Janine Jones and Kimberly Sines, there is no information provided to potential employers if a nurse is under investigation. No red flags, no under investigation, no beware, this person could be a danger. Criminal defense attorney and professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, Challen Young, said, "My concern would be that the welfare of the institution and the facility is being placed above the welfare of the patient. She worries about the lack of safeguards in place and the lack of changes enacted since Heather's arrest and conviction."
Can't we appoint her to a regulatory position?
Right? Because of the scope and number of victims, and because her destruction spanned so many different facilities, the AG's office actually set up a tip line so people could either call in with concerning behavior they witnessed regarding Heather or family members of possible victims that were under her care.
On the one hand, it's good that they want to uncover all of her crimes, but on the other hand, the poor people who had needed that tip line.
Yeah, I'm sure any family members that had a relative die at any of these facilities where Heather worked would be skeptical. I mean, I sure would be.
I don't know how you couldn't be.
Right? 6 months after Heather's arrest and detainment at the Butler County Prison, the AG's office filed additional charges against Heather for allegedly mistreating more patients since 2020. The victims, as we've mentioned, ranged in age from 43 to 104. The new charges were 2 counts of first degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder and 19 counts of neglect of a care dependent person. The attempted murder charges were for cases without physical evidence. The cause of death could not be determined or the victim survived.
Back to those text messages that Heather sent her mother. Here are just a few so you can get a feeling for her depravity. I'm gonna murder already. One from June 10th, 2022 read, other text messages discussed her patients and coworkers. In a September 2nd, 2022 text message, Heather allegedly told her mother that she was gonna murder my aides. On December 7th, 2022, she wrote, she could be dead. She hasn't made a noise since 9, and I'm not going to check on her. Or this one on December 25th, 2022. I can't with this lady tonight. She's going to get pillow therapy. Maybe she was pissed that she was working on Christmas because she also said that same night, I may kill this resident. I need to set some sort of boundaries with him. He's following me and he's driving me nuts. Lest we think her anger is just directed at coworkers and patients, she also sent, can I kill this man at Taco Bell? To her mother on April 2022.
Obviously, this isn't normal behavior, especially for a nurse caring for patients. I mean, I would love to know what her mother said in response.
For real, please don't tell me she thought she was kidding. They never fucking are.
Just like it's never a mannequin.
Just like that.
During a scheduled status hearing, Heather argued with her lawyers and said she wanted to plead guilty. "Why are you pleading guilty?" Attorney De Pascal asked her. "Because I am guilty," she answered. Heather pled guilty to 3 counts of first degree murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. For her guilty plea, Heather escaped a death sentence by lethal injection. Capital punishment is legal, though rarely used in Pennsylvania. The irony that she escaped death by lethal injection when so many patients died from her wielding a lethal injection seems unjust, though I imagine a nurse killing elderly patients in care homes doesn't fare well in prison.
To be honest, I'm not sure who fares well in prison, not that I'm feeling bad for Heather.
I mean, that's true. Before her sentencing, Heather said, "I just wanted to say I'm very sorry for what I've done. I know I've impacted a lot of lives, including my parents, and I'm deeply sorry for what I've done." She was given 3 consecutive life sentences and an additional 380 to 760 years for the 19 counts of criminal attempts to commit murder. Heather had to sit in the courtroom while relatives of her victims gave impact statements. And I just have to say, this gives me a little bit of joy when a horrific murderer is obligated by the court to listen to the victim's relatives and the impact that their callousness caused. I mean, I don't think it provides closure per se. I'm not really sure closure exists for victims. It is just a nice thing people say. It reminds me when someone says, some empty words like, "Our thoughts and prayers are with the family." Anyway, I feel like it gives these relatives some of the power that the murderer took away.
I completely agree. Even if the killer isn't affected by the heart wrenching statements, at least the families can honor their loved ones by speaking about the devastating effect of their loss. It's not closure, but it's something.
Agreed.
Heather, of course, didn't look at the relatives or react to their comments. "I hope you live to 100," Jack Rogers' niece told her, and I'm certainly not going to argue for shortening her suffering. Nick Simble's sister, Melinda Brown, called him a social butterfly. He loved to socialize at the nurse's station, she said, while looking at Heather. She added that her brother often called Heather bad names, and she regrets making him apologize to her. She told his murderer, "Heather, now I know Nick was right about you." Mary Beth Graham said she wonders about what her father, Gerald Shrum, went through. "None of us were with him in his last moments," she said. "Did he know she was trying to kill him? Was he frightened?" Her sister, Linda White, spoke of the guilt she felt. She'd chosen Sunnyview because it was close enough for the family to visit her father every day. "The guilt, oh, the guilt," she said. "And it's in no way their fault, but you absolutely would feel guilty. That's a burden they wouldn't have to bear if not for Heather."
Too true.
Elizabeth Ozella, daughter of Irene Simons, tried to comfort the others. "To the other families," she said, turning around to face the gallery during her statement, "it wouldn't have mattered if you were there every day, because I was, and I still couldn't stop her." She said her mother, a woman of faith, would have forgiven Heather, and she would have wanted her daughter to do the same. "She's not there," she said. "Not right now, maybe never."
I'm with her. I would be the exact same.
Yeah, I sure as hell wouldn't forgive her. Some family members asked Heather to look at them, though she never did. For hours, she looked straight ahead, slouched in the chair between her defense attorneys. "Please look at me. I would greatly appreciate it," said Deborah Bly, the daughter of James Fair. She waited, but Heather didn't move. She appropriately described her as having no guts. While some spoke of forgiveness, Eric Albee did not. His brother, Elmer Albee, and we have to assume that he was EA, the man sharing a room with James Bartow at QLSC, who had a near fatal incident on August 31st. Even though Elmer pulled through, he continued to suffer. "You will not be being forgiven by this family," his brother said. "I hope the judicial system, prison, and God have zero mercy on you." But attorney De Lucente, her lawyer, said she wasn't all bad after she was removed from the courthouse to start her sentence in a state prison facility. He added that You could see at the end she was remorseful. He said his client wanted to fess up to what she had done from the very beginning of the investigation. As to her motivations, he pointed to the fact that she'd worked for years in a veterinary facility where her duties included euthanasia. She didn't want to see anyone suffer, he said.
I almost choked on my popcorn reading that. Was he able to spout that bullshit with a straight face?
That's great. That's how some defense attorneys make the big bucks, I guess.
Maybe that helps him sleep at night.
Yeah.
Attorney General Michelle Henry said the defendant used her position of trust as a means to poison patients who depended on her for care. She continued, this plea and life sentence will not bring back the life's loss, but it will ensure she never has another opportunity to inflict further harm. At least 9 lawsuits have been filed by victims' families against several care facilities.
Good.
These are civil lawsuits, and the AG's office, who successfully prosecuted the criminal charges, is not involved. The lawsuits include counts of negligence and vicarious liability, claiming that even though Heather was fired because of her negligent behavior, she continued to be hired by other care facilities. Attorney Pierce represents 5 families whose family members were victims of Heather's actions. One case has been resolved with Quality Life Care Facility. Those specific settlement terms have not been made public. 4 other cases are still in litigation. Attorney Pierce said his firm was hired by the families of Heather Pressdee's victims to get answers as to how she was permitted to continue working in these facilities despite her erratic, disturbing, and abusive behavior.
Which is the very least that they deserve.
Agreed. Additional suits have also been filed by the law firm of Hal K. Waldman and Associates. One suit was filed against Armstrong Rehabilitation and Nursing Facility on behalf of family members of a 90-year-old woman who died 1 month after Heather was hired. The suit contends that staff members of the facility were negligent by failing to prevent Heather from administering unprescribed insulin to the patient, who was being treated for dementia, and failing to report or act on reports regarding suspected abuse, among other claims.
One of the questions people have when they hear a case like this, or like the ones we've recently covered in our other killer nurse episodes, is how? How were they able to get away with it for so long? For some reason, background checks don't seem to be a priority for a lot of these medical facilities. There is a nursing shortage in the US, as there is in many other countries, and hiring and retaining qualified nurses at nursing homes and residential facilities for older adults can be an uphill battle. Pile on top of that the fact that Heather was working at the height of the COVID pandemic when staff shortages were especially high. A lot of facilities were probably happy to have hired someone. And if they did wonder why her previous jobs were so short, they didn't want to question things too much. Also, if they did actually speak to a prior employer, they wouldn't legally be able to say that she was fired because they thought she was killing patients. If they contacted the nursing board, they would have found no criminal convictions and discovered that her nursing license was still active. Additionally, Heather worked mainly at private, for profit institutions. At these institutions, investigations into concerns of wrongdoing and any disciplinary actions would have been handled internally and privately. Potential employers would not be aware of any suspicions, patterns, or unusual behavior. For profit medical facilities, as the name suggests, are for profit. They aren't going to share suspicions that they employed a potential killer. The potential fallout from something like that could destroy their business.
The next question is, of course, why? Why does someone choose to go into a field like nursing and become a murderer? The reasons are varied, as we have discussed in our other episodes. I know Heather's attorneys said that she believed that she was relieving patient suffering. I don't believe that, even a little bit. None of Heather's victims were knocking on death's door. She was rude and volatile, making statements to her colleagues about how they needed to die, or why were they taking so long to die, or they just shouldn't be here. There was no compassion. If she set her sights on a particular patient and they took too long to die, she would give them another dose of insulin to expedite their death. I don't think she had a God complex and that she felt superior, but I definitely think she enjoyed the power that she literally decided who lived and who died. What do you think?
I think the text messages she sent to her mom, like, I can't with this lady tonight, she's going to get pillow therapy, showed that not even Heather believed that she was acting out of compassion. I would say, rather than Elizabeth Wetlaufer's perception of killing as an addiction, or Beverly Allitt's Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy to get attention, which Janine Jones might also have had, I could somewhat compare her to Jane Toppin experimenting just because she could, but I think Heather most closely resembles Kimberly Signs in resenting having to care for patients she may or may not have liked. Heather didn't seem to particularly enjoy the caring part of her job. She saw them as old and sick, and in her mind, dying anyways. So why not revel in her power and speed up the process?
It really is horrifying.
Truly.
Next week, we will be beginning our new true crime theme, religious leaders who kill family members. First up, Pastor Arthur Burton Shermer.
All the sources we used for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or a theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifyingly Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifyingly Typical Pod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.